All right, so let's continue here with the 044. So as I think you can maybe see here, case is nice and clean, about as clean as we're gonna get it at any rate. And one thing I noticed when after this case had dried out, it wanted to kind of spot a little bit of rust in here, so I'm guessing that Stihl must have a little bit of steel or something like that in their alloy, their magnesium alloy case here. And but instead of using like some penetrant lubricant, I'm going to use actually some anti-seize here to install the crank bearing. Not much, I'm just going to grab a little bit of it, and that should help both with a little bit of lubrication to get the bearing in place, and should help with some of the anti-corrosion here. So I'm just going to take a very little bit and apply that to the bearing pocket here. Don't need much. This stuff gets everywhere, so I'm going to clean it up a little bit. If I get it a little thick in some spots, I'll just wipe that a little bit. There we go. Now that pocket is ready to receive the bearing on this clutch side. Now on the clutch side for this saw, they've actually got, maybe you can see here, hold on a second. All right, so maybe you can see better here that this faces the outside, faces the clutch. This side here faces the inside of the crankcase, and it's got this what looks like a little plastic race holder there. That's flush with the inside of the crankcase. This outer race here is actually going to extend beyond the crankcase, and the seal will mount inside this outer race. The crank seal will. A little different from most chainsaw bearing installations that I'm familiar with. And so the side of the case, or the pocket that this mounts in, if it's damaged much, then you have a real problem, because it could easily, these surfaces here could quite easily pass air. So you do want to make sure that you've got them nice and clean, and that there aren't any issues with the bearing pocket surfaces. And since this pocket here is a through pocket, there's no natural stop in it, what we've got to do is mount the oiler. And the way this is designed, if we get up close here with the oiler, you'll be able to see that the bearing, the outer race of the bearing, actually mounts into that, right like this. So that's how it mounts. I don't know if you can see real well on the inside here. And then, so that's how that mounts. So we need to use the oiler here as the actual bearing stop. So to do that, we're going to mount this in the crankcase before we do anything. And so what I'm going to do here, this little oiler arm here will pivot, and so you have to, it may take a little bit to get it seated in the oiler hole, the exit hole, so that you get this lined up. I've already pre-fit it, and then I'll double check right in here to make sure everything's lining up. And then it's just a matter of taking the oiler housing mounting screws. Now you're going to want to take the plastic stop on this end of the oiler, and then the O-ring. Actually, you take the guts out of the oiler because there's O-rings, and then there's an O-ring on the end here you need to take off because well, not in this case. If you're going to heat the crankcase and drop the bearings in a hot crankcase, you need to do that. I'm going to install them dry. I don't really think there's any reason why you can't. Usually bearings can be installed hot or dry. Regardless of hot or dry, you need to install this oiler housing so that you get the bearing installed at the correct depth. Now, there's a chance that I might not have had to have done this because the bearing is going to more or less be flush against the inside of the crankcase. And so if I use a proper press, which is what I'm going to use, a homemade press, to press this bearing in instead of knocking it, then, you know, I could use a press and the washer that will then make the crankcase serve as a stop instead of the oiler here. But we do want to get the bearing seated correctly in the oiler, so we might as well just use it as a stop. So how I'm going to approach this, instead of, you can use a socket, or in this case we have an arbor. This is the OEM tool for installing the bearing, like so, knocking it down all the way to the stop. That's a lot of brute force. I'm just not really happy with that kind of approach. I am going to use this to get it started, but once I get it started, then I'm going to use a homemade press that I'll show you here. So to get it started, I'm going to do my best to just get it lined up flush, press it in with my fingers, double check that I have it in there relatively flush before I start knocking it. And once I think I got it about where I want it, I'll just grab the knocker tool here, or the arbor, and I'm just going to give it a little tap. So all this has done is gotten it started so that it's not going to fall out. And that does look nice and flush. All right. So now we're done with the arbor, done with our malleable mallet. And I'm going to go ahead and take my homemade press, which is grade 8 bolts, nuts, and washers. And this happens to be about a 1/2 inch bolt, 3/4 inch washer, and then a 2-inch washer. I'm just going to drop that down now along the bearing. And I'm going to do the same thing now on this side. Get the nut started. I'm going to do my best to try and get things somewhat centered. Okay. So now it's just a matter of getting a couple tools here. We'll get a socket. Actually, I might be able to get by with a 19 millimeter, I believe. Yeah, 19 millimeter. You can either use ratcheting box end, standard box end, or a socket. And we're just going to send it home here. Now, because I'm putting even pressure and I had it started flush, and you might hear a little bit of noise, but the anti-seize that I use is serving as a pretty good lubricant. So all I got to do is just keep wrenching on this. And I'll just do this until it comes to a hard stop. And at that point, it should be fully seated in the oiler housing. If you get the bearing started crooked, you'll know that because it'll bind. All right, I'm not going to crank on that too hard once it stops. Now all I have to do is just loosen the nut, and I'm done. I have now pressed the bearing home. I can then look at it on the inside here to make sure that it is flush against the oiler surface all the way around, and it is. So now what I can do, I like to feel these. You know, they should go in silky smooth, and when they're done being installed, if there's no stress on the bearing, lateral stresses were put on the bearing, it should be as silky smooth as before you put it in, and this one is. So it's nice and flush here against the case and perfectly seated in the oiler. So now it's just a matter of undoing the oiler housing, and I will be ready to continue assembling this half of the case. I'm not going to quite yet put the seal in, nor am I going to quite yet start to lubricate the bearings. I'm going to wait until I have more of the saw together. All right, so pop the oiler back out, and you can see how the side of that, or the edge of that race, is raised above the crankcase plane. The seal will mount on the inside there. So from this point on, you do need to be careful that you're not getting a lot of stuff on either side of the bearing here, because you don't want dirt in that bearing. All right, so now we'll just proceed the same way with the other smaller bearing. So it just so happens that this bearing also has kind of a little plastic race support in there. That's going to be on the outside, so it's going to be facing the flywheel. This right here will be the inside. So just as I did before, I'm going to take a little bit of anti-seize, checking to make sure everything's good with the bearing pocket. And then I'll grab some anti-seize. Just a thin coating. Put that stuff away now because it gets everywhere. Okay. Can use the same arbor to get it started. I want to make sure I'm fairly certain I have it flush before I start knocking it. Using the same arbor. There, she started. Pretty simple. And now we're going to use exactly the same process that we did before. I'll drop this down. I'm going to keep it centered as I can. All right. So because these are a little more recessed on this half of the case, I am going to grab a 19mm socket to help us out. And just as we saw with the other side, as long as I started it nice and flush, it should just press in nice and easy. It'll come up against that interior stop of the crankcase, and we are done. That's simple. Back off the nut. Whoops, sorry about that. Boy, I hope you weren't blurred for that whole process. All right. So the bearing is in place, and it is flush on the inside. And that's all she wrote. Ready for oil seals. All right. We're going to go back to the clutch side here before we get too much further along. And we're going to press in some of the rubber parts. Well, this is a stop buffer that, let's see here, it fits in. About like so. There we go. Now, it might be hard to get it in by just pressing it, because it has a little ridge and groove that needs to come up and over and fit over this edge. And I find sometimes it's really nice just to have something to press it with. So I'm just using a little extension for my drill that I use with Allen bits. Once I get it in enough, I'm gonna use a dental tool or even just a small screwdriver to make sure that, see how it's still got some more room to come there. So I'm prying it up and over so that it seats correctly, doesn't end up coming loose. As simple as this may be for anti-vibration and as a equipment stop, it works pretty well. So that is fully seated. Okay. Now there's two rubber AV mounts or AV buffers on this side. They're identical. They'll eventually get screwed into the crankcase. These can be a little bit challenging. We'll see if we can do these without any lubrication. But they should just, you can see that they have a groove right here, and there's a groove down there. And so you got to press it past this ridge so that it fits into the groove. This is another example where you may need to have a socket extension or something like that to help press it home. Yep, that works really good. There we go. Do the same thing with this one. And you can even hear it snap in place there. All right, so we got that done on that side. So let's go ahead and put the rubber AV mounts on the ignition side as well. One in the lower front, much smaller than the ones on the clutch side. Again, has a groove here that's gonna, you just press it in. There, she just snaps right in place. Now the one in the back is actually up high, and it's mounted with a couple bolts. All these bolts on this are T27s. Now I'm not going to completely get these super tight, just going to get them a little hand tight and make sure that they're not going to unscrew and fall out. But all right, so now we're ready for the next task.